Hey, I'm Alex, a 17-year-old guy, and I'm here to share a story that completely turned my life upside down. It's about how I discovered my parents' double standards and the choices I had to make to reclaim my dignity. A few months ago, as I prepared to start college, I was hit with a bombshell. My parents said they wouldn't be covering my tuition. To say I was blindsided would be an understatement. I had always assumed they'd pay for my education, just as they had done for my older brother, Chris, who is 6 years my senior. Our family isn't struggling financially, far from it. My dad, Mark, is a successful engineer, and my mom, Rachel, is a dedicated nurse. They had always lived comfortably, and I had no reason to believe otherwise. When I was accepted into my dream school, I was ecstatic. It was a moment I had worked hard for, and I thought my parents would be proud and ready to support me. But when I brought up the subject of tuition, their response caught me completely off guard. They said they wanted me to learn the value of independence by paying for college myself, whether through loans or part-time work. I was stunned. Why? Because they hadn't asked Chris to do the same. Chris had gone to one of the top business schools in the state, and my parents had covered every single penny of his tuition. Dad had even bragged about it to friends and family, saying Chris was his best investment. So why was I suddenly on my own? When I confronted them, they told me they simply didn't have the funds anymore. My dad explained that he had been paying for his uncle's medical treatments over the past 2 years. This uncle, a man who had helped my dad early in his career, was diagnosed with leukemia and had no one else to care for him. His own family had abandoned him, and my dad felt indebted enough to step in and cover his medical bills. At first, I believed him. I knew this story wasn't entirely false. My dad's uncle had been sick for a while, and we'd often visited him in the hospital. It made sense that my dad would feel obligated to help, but as much as I admired the gesture, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Why hadn't they planned better? Why did I have to bear the brunt of their choices when Chris had been given a free pass? I told myself to screw it up. I'd figure out a way to manage. I had some savings from internships, but they were nowhere near enough to cover tuition. I started looking for part-time jobs to earn as much as I could before classes began, though the thought of taking on student loans haunted me. I didn't want to start my adult life drowning in debt, but things took a darker turn when I stumbled upon the truth. A truth that shattered what little trust I had left in my parents. I had been trying to accept my parents' reasoning. I kept telling myself that Dad's story about helping his uncle made sense, and maybe it was just bad timing that there wasn't enough money left for my college. But deep down, something didn't feel right. That nagging doubt wouldn't let go. One evening, as I was scrolling through my phone, a notification popped up. It was a group chat with a few high school friends, and they were sending me screenshots of a post Chris had made on social media. I hadn't seen it myself because I had him blocked. We didn't get along, and I'd cut ties long ago. But my friends still followed him, and what they showed me made my blood boil. Chris had posted a family photo, but I was cropped out of it. Classic. The caption was worse. He was thanking our parents for always believing in him, and for being the first investors in his new business venture. That's right, investors. The same parents who claimed they couldn't afford my tuition were now pumping money into Chris's dream. I couldn't believe it. I sat there staring at the screen, rereading the caption over and over like I had somehow misread it. My friends were just as shocked. They kept asking, "How can they do this? Didn't they say they didn't have the money for you?" I didn't have any answers. All I felt was anger, confusion, and betrayal. For days I debated whether to confront my parents. On one hand, I wanted answers. On the other hand, I already knew what they'd do. They'd deny, deflect, or spin some story about how it wasn't what it looked like. And Chris, he'd probably play dumb, even though he loved rubbing things like this in my face. I decided not to say anything. Talking to them felt pointless. Instead, I started making my own plans. If my parents had shown me anything, it was that I was on my own. I packed a bag quietly over the next few days and reached out to my friend Jake, someone I could always count on. Jake's family had always been kind to me, and when I explained the situation, they didn't hesitate to offer me a place to stay. The night I left, I felt surprisingly calm. I didn't slam the door or leave a dramatic note. I just grabbed my things and called an Uber. As I pulled away from the house, I realized I wasn't sad. I was relieved. I was finally leaving behind the toxic environment where I was always second to Chris. Jake's family welcomed me with open arms. They even offered to help pay for my college tuition, which floors me. These weren't even my parents, yet they were willing to step up in ways my own family wouldn't. I told them I needed some time to think about their offer. It felt weird accepting something so big, but their kindness gave me hope. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Meanwhile, my phone was blowing up. My parents noticed I was gone the next morning, and the texts and calls started flooding in. At first, it was all concern. Where are you? Are you safe? But as the day went on, the tone shifted. They started demanding answers. Why are you doing this to us? Do you realize how much you're hurting us? I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded them the screenshot of Chris's post and left it at that. I didn't need to explain myself. The truth was right there for them to see. Their response? Excuses. A flood of them. My dad claimed they were protecting me by not telling me about the investment in Chris's business. He said they were planning to use the returns from his business to help me pay off any student loans I might take out. Really? They expected me to believe that? If helping me was really part of the plan, why not just be honest from the start? What hurt the most wasn't the money. It was the message behind their actions. They were willing to take a chance on Chris and his business, but not on me. Sending me to college would have cost far less than funding a startup, but they still chose him. It was like they were saying without words that I wasn't worth the investment. I texted them back once, just to make my stance clear. I'm not coming back. Don't contact me again. But that wasn't the end of it. My mom started texting me nonstop, apologizing and blaming my dad. She said she never wanted to go along with his plan, but felt pressured into it. According to her, Dad convinced her that funding Chris's business was the smarter move because they'd get their money back faster. She claimed she hated lying to me but didn't know how to stop once the lies started. At first, I ignored her too. I wasn't ready to forgive anyone. But her messages started to take a desperate tone. She said she couldn't lose me and was willing to do whatever it took to fix things. That's when things between her and Dad started to unravel. After a few days of radio silence, the texts from my mom started pouring in again, but this time they were different. She wasn't just apologizing anymore. She was unraveling. She began spilling everything, blaming my dad for the situation, and even threatening to leave him if he didn't do something to make things right. At first, I brushed it off. I didn't want to be caught in the middle of their fights, but as the messages kept coming, it was clear that things between them were getting worse. My mom told me they had been arguing nonstop since I left. She said my dad refused to admit he had done anything wrong and insisted that I was overreacting. He thought I'd come crawling back once I calmed down, but my mom was different. She said she couldn't live with herself if I never forgave her. She confessed that she'd been against investing in Chris's business from the start. She'd argued that they should prioritize my education, but Dad had convinced her it was a smart financial move. According to her, he sold the idea as a way to help both of us. Chris would succeed and repay the investment, which would then help me with my loans. I couldn't believe how short-sighted that plan was. Did they even consider the risk? What if Chris failed? Or what if he succeeded and decided not to pay them back? It didn't seem like they'd thought any of this through, and now it was blowing up in their faces. Mom told me she was done being a bystander. She said she was going to pull out of Chris's business deal entirely and focus on making things right with me, even if it meant going against my dad. I didn't know how to feel about that. On one hand, I was glad someone in my family was finally standing up for me. On the other hand, it was hard to trust her after everything that had happened. Meanwhile, my dad wasn't taking any of it well. Mom told me he blamed me for ruining their marriage. He thought my leaving was a dramatic overreaction and that I was being selfish for not considering their situation. Selfish? The irony of that accusation wasn't lost on me. If anyone had been selfish, it was the man who gambled my future on Chris's untested business venture. Then came the bombshell. My mom told me she was serious about leaving him if he didn't make an effort to fix things. She was tired of his stubbornness and refusal to admit he'd made a mistake. She said she couldn't stand by and watch their relationship deteriorate because of his pride. I didn't know what to think. The idea that my decision to leave could break up my parents' marriage was a lot to process. Part of me felt guilty, like I was responsible for their fights. But another part of me knew this wasn't my fault. My dad had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. Still, the weight of it all was overwhelming. Every day, I'd get updates from my mom about their arguments. She said Dad kept insisting they'd done the right thing, and that I just needed time to come to my senses. He didn't understand why I was so upset and accused my mom of being too soft on me. According to her, he'd even said, "If Alex doesn't want to come back, that's his problem. He's acting like a spoiled brat." That was the last straw for me. If he wanted to write me off as some ungrateful kid, fine. I didn't need his approval, and I definitely didn't need his excuses. But things got even messier. My mom told me she had finally informed Chris about her decision to pull out of his business. She told him she wasn't going to fund his startup anymore because her priority was now me. As expected, Chris didn't take it well. He accused her of betraying him and said she was only doing it because I had manipulated her. Classic Chris, always the victim. Mom said he stormed out of the house and hadn't spoken to her since. She didn't regret her decision, though. She told me it was the first time in years that she felt like she was doing the right thing. As for my dad, he wasn't happy about it either. He told my mom that she was being reckless and that pulling out of Chris's business would ruin their family legacy. Legacy? The man was delusional. There wasn't going to be any legacy if they kept alienating their own children. By this point, I was starting to feel the pressure. My mom was clearly on the brink of leaving my dad, and every day I stayed away seemed to push them closer to the edge. I knew their marriage wasn't perfect, but it had always seemed stable. Now, it felt like a house of cards about to collapse. Still, I wasn't ready to go back. I needed time to process everything. My dad's betrayal, my mom's silence, Chris's entitlement. It was all too much. And while I appreciated my mom's efforts to make things right, I couldn't just forget everything that had happened. It had been 10 days since I left home. 10 days of ignoring my dad's cold indifference, my mom's desperate apologies, and the chaos that seemed to be unraveling back at my parents' house. I'd been staying at Jake's, trying to focus on my future and what I needed to do for myself. But as the days passed, my mom's messages became harder to ignore. She wasn't just apologizing anymore. She was pleading. She said she missed me and that she couldn't stand the thought of our relationship being broken forever. She promised she would fix everything, even if it meant pulling every dollar she could scrape together to pay for my college tuition. She said she had already cut ties with Chris's business and was ready to go against my dad if it meant getting me back. I wasn't sure what to do. On one hand, her words felt genuine. She seemed to truly regret the choices she'd made and was doing everything she could to make amends. But on the other hand, I still felt raw. The lies, the betrayal, the way my dad and Chris had treated me, it was a wound that hadn't healed yet. But there was one thing I knew. My mom wasn't the enemy here. She'd made mistakes, yes, but she was trying to fix them. And as much as I didn't want to admit it, I missed her too. Jake and his family had been incredible to me, but they weren't my mom. And while I didn't care much about my dad or Chris at this point, I couldn't just ignore her efforts to make things right. That's how I found myself back in front of my parents' house one evening, my heart pounding as I stared at the door. I wasn't sure what I was walking into. Would my dad be angry? Would my mom break down? Would Chris even be there? I had no idea, but I knew I had to face it eventually. When my mom opened the door and saw me standing there, she burst into tears. She threw her arms around me and started apologizing, her words coming out in broken sobs. "I'm so sorry, Alex," she kept repeating. "I was wrong. I should have stood up for you. Please forgive me." I hugged her back, not knowing what else to do. Seeing her like that broke something inside me. She wasn't the cold, indifferent parent I had imagined when I left. She was just as hurt as I was, and for the first time, I felt like we were on the same side. My dad, on the other hand, wasn't nearly as welcoming. He stood in the corner of the living room, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a scowl on his face. He didn't say a word, and I didn't either. I wasn't here for him. My mom led me to the kitchen, where we sat down and talked. She told me everything. How she'd finally told Chris she wouldn't be funding his business. how he'd accused her of betraying him and hadn't spoken to her since. She said she didn't care anymore. Her only priority now was fixing things with me. She also told me about the fights she'd been having with my dad. She said they'd barely spoken to each other in the past week, and that she was seriously considering leaving him if he didn't stop blaming me for everything. "I'm done defending him," she said. "You were right to leave, Alex. What we did to you was wrong, and I can't pretend otherwise anymore." It was hard to hear. I'd grown up thinking my parents' marriage was unshakable, but now it felt like it was crumbling before my eyes. And while I didn't blame my mom for wanting to stand up for herself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow responsible for their unraveling. As for Chris, he wasn't home, which was a relief. According to my mom, he'd been sulking ever since she told him she was cutting him off. She said he hadn't taken it well and had stormed out of the house, claiming he'd find other investors who believed in him. Typical Chris, always making himself the victim. That night, I stayed in my old room. It felt strange being back. The place felt the same, but I didn't. I couldn't shake the tension in the air or the way my dad avoided speaking to me. My mom tried to act normal, cooking my favorite meals and chatting with me like old times, but I could see how tired she was. She was carrying the weight of everything, and it showed. The next morning, things took an unexpected turn. My dad announced at breakfast that he was moving out. He said he'd had enough of the drama and needed space to think. My mom didn't try to stop him, and I didn't say anything either. In a way, I was relieved. His presence had been like a dark cloud hanging over the house, and maybe now my mom and I could finally start to rebuild without his negativity dragging us down. But as much as I tried to focus on the progress my mom and I were making, the situation with my dad and Chris still weighed on me. My dad had gone to live with Chris, and according to my mom, they were now working on the business together. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd left his own family to support the golden child. If that didn't prove where his loyalties lay, I didn't know what did. Despite everything, I tried to focus on the positives. My mom had stayed true to her word and started working on arranging my college tuition. She even reached out to her parents for help, something she said she hadn't done in years. She was determined to make sure I didn't have to worry about money, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone in my family had my back. A few weeks later, I found myself standing on my college campus, the fresh start I'd been longing for finally within reach. My mom had come through, just like she promised. She scraped together enough money with help from her parents and some savings she'd hidden away. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the suffocating weight of financial uncertainty pressing down on me. But while I was beginning this new chapter, the mess I'd left behind at home wasn't over. My dad was still living with Chris, fully invested, literally and emotionally, in his business. From what my mom told me, they'd officially gone into partnership, and my dad had practically washed his hands of the rest of us. They were working together to make Chris's startup a success, and honestly, I wasn't surprised. My dad had made his choice clear. The distance from home gave me perspective, but it didn't make everything easier. My mom and I talked often, and while our relationship was mending, there was still some pain I couldn't let go of just yet. I appreciated all she was doing for me now, but the memory of her silence during the lies and favoritism still lingered. I knew she was genuinely trying to rebuild our bond, and that effort mattered. It gave me hope that over time we could truly heal. As for my dad, I decided not to waste energy on him. He hadn't reached out to me once since I left home. Not a call, not a text, nothing. It was clear that he saw me as the problem, and honestly, that was fine with me. I wasn't interested in repairing a relationship with someone who didn't respect me or value me equally. Chris was no different. He was still bitter about my mom pulling her support from his business and, according to her, hadn't spoken to her since she made that decision. I didn't miss him either. Growing up, he was always the center of attention, and now, even as an adult, he demanded the same spotlight. If anything, his attitude only confirmed that I'd made the right decision to cut him out of my life. College brought a new rhythm to my days, one that didn't revolve around the toxic dynamics of my family. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make the most of this opportunity. My mom's sacrifices weren't lost on me, and I wanted to prove that her faith in me wasn't misplaced. I was also lucky to make some great friends early on, people who supported me without judgment and made me feel like I belonged. Despite the progress, there were moments when the past still haunted me. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about what might have been if things had been different. If my parents had treated me and Chris equally, if they hadn't lied to me, if they had stood by me from the start, maybe I wouldn't have felt so disconnected from them now. But I reminded myself that dwelling on the what-ifs wouldn't change anything. All I could do was move forward. My mom and I spoke one evening during my first semester. She told me she had started going to counseling on her own. She said it was helping her unpack everything she'd been through, from her own guilt about the situation with me to the struggles in her marriage. She admitted that she didn't know if she and my dad would ever reconcile, but she was okay with that. "I just want to focus on being the best mom I can be for you," she said. And for the first time in a while, I believed her. Hearing that gave me peace. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was an honest one. My mom was trying, and that effort mattered more than anything else. She reminded me that family isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, even when it's messy, and putting in the work to make things better. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything, I can't say I'm completely over what happened. The scars are still there, and I don't think they'll fade anytime soon. But I've learned something important. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family that truly supports you. Sometimes you have to find your own way, even if it means leaving people behind. I'm grateful for the people who stood by me, Jake and his family, my mom, my new friends. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, even when it felt like the world was against me. And while I may never have the picture-perfect family I once hoped for, I've made peace with that. My story isn't just about what I lost, it's also about what I gained: strength, independence, and the realization that I deserve better. Story 2. Although he discovered me cheating, my spouse didn't anticipate this. Okay, so here's the problem. There was supposed to be nothing serious about it. I've been with my spouse Thomas for 7 years, married for 5 years. Ethan is a 5-year-old boy that we have. I suppose family life was usual. It's the type of usual that goes by automatically and you don't really pause to think about it. Thomas is an architect by profession. Well done! Excellent! You mean to pay for the entire package? I work for a tiny IT company in marketing. It covers the bills, but it's not very glamorous. It was a typical life. I would go to my office and he would go to his. At the end of the day, we would meet up at home. After the team supper, give Ethan a bath and put him to bed. After that, we'd be in bed. It was all okay. At least that's what I believed. However, Thomas received a significant promotion at work 5 months ago. Furthermore, I was pleased for him. Really? Yes, I was. It was what he had been searching for, probably one of his main professional objectives. However, that came with additional duties and longer hours. He was almost living at the business all of a sudden. I assumed things would calm down eventually. Perhaps he was only attempting to establish himself in the new position. However, no, it grew worse, if anything. When he arrived home, I would wait for him in the hopes that we might spend some time together, but he would simply drag himself in, barely getting a high before passing out on the couch. He wouldn't always even get to bed. Like some kind of tired robot, he would simply collapse in the living room while still dressed for work. I initially believed that it was only a difficult time. He'll move on. It's the time for adjustment. However, weeks and months went by. The problem is that I was missing more than simply his attention, if you get what I mean. He would just stare at me half asleep and mutter something like, "I'm really tired?" if I tried to start a conversation in the bedroom. Perhaps tomorrow. Warning, there was never a tomorrow. So, yes, I did begin to feel a little rejected. Not only that, but emotionally as well. He seemed to have stopped seeing me, as if I were only a part of the daily grind he endured outside of work. That really began to play with my brain. All I was hoping for was a connection that never materialized. I had no idea what to do, and my frustration increased as I gave it more attention. Around this time, I also noticed that my work was becoming more demanding. We were attempting to get this large client. Simon had a little financial advisory business. He was important to us because it would have had a significant impact if we had signed him, such as a company-wide agreement. That's why I felt so much pressure to make it happen. Ever the king of ambiguous encouragement, my supervisor advised me to go above and above with Simon. She even suggested that in order to gain his trust, I need to be a little more amiable and intimate. I don't want to offend anyone, but please just be friendly. That's business jargon for doing whatever it takes without breaching the law. In an effort to give Simon a sense of worth, I began to spend more time with him, proving to him that our business wasn't simply another faceless icy one. Coffee breaks, lunches, and lengthy discussions about his needs and what we might do to help him. Everything. I was following instructions. I suppose that all of the work-related activities also kept me somewhat busy. The irony is that Simon was genuinely quite pleasant to be around. He is 48, childless, and divorced. Although he wasn't precisely my type, he had a laid-back demeanor, was often making jokes and lighthearted, and was generally pleasant to chat to. This was a huge break from the quiet I was experiencing at home. During our lunch dates, he would inquire about my day and listen to me complain about trivial matters. He appeared to be genuinely interested, you know. There is one lunch that sticks out. It was one of those hectic days, I recall. Work was simply unrelenting, and Ethan had been a pain in the ass all morning. Then, in the restaurant, I poured water all over my clothes. It was just my luck. I dismissed it with a joke, but when I looked up, Simon was looking at me differently. There was definitely something in his gaze that made me feel recognized, even if he wasn't being eerie. I know that sounds pitiful, but I experienced a rush from that gaze that I hadn't had in months. I could actually tell that someone was paying attention to me. At first, I dismissed it, telling myself that I was dreaming and that he was only being amiable, but I couldn't help but feel something, a spark that hadn't been there in what felt like an eternity. Our discussions then became a little more intimate, nothing extraordinary. He just inquired about my life, how things were doing at home, and other such things. Even though I wasn't going to spill my guts, Simon would nod, listen, and give me pitying glances when I hinted that things weren't going well between us. I believe he realized how lonely I was rather quickly, and I suppose I enjoyed that he saw that we began to have more lunches together, and occasionally meals when it was convenient. To be honest, I began to anticipate these little getaways. I would think, oh, I get to see Simon today, as I left the workplace. It was simple. I was loving the attention, even though I didn't have to be content or like everything was all right. I'm not proud to say it, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that I was deemed beautiful, that someone genuinely cared, and that they wanted to hear about my day. It had been a while since I had felt that way, and I couldn't get enough of this small high that was irresistible. In retrospect, I can see how it began to go from being solely business to something more. However, I didn't want to acknowledge it at the moment. I convinced myself that I was only carrying out my duties and that I was being amiable. Even if it wasn't physical, I believe I understood deep down that I was going too far. I was playing with fire, telling myself that since we weren't doing anything wrong, it wouldn't hurt. I suppose that's how it begins for everyone. The line simply continues going even if you believe it's all innocent. I wish I could say that's where I ended it. I wish I could say that I stepped back and refocused my efforts on my marriage, or at the very least, that I had a tough talk with Thomas about my feelings, but I didn't. I let the connection with Simon to deepen and allowed myself to get drawn in by the excitement and attention, because I felt appreciated for once. That's the line I promised myself I would never cross. To be honest, I didn't see it coming when I crossed it, which, now that I think about it, is foolish. However, it just sort of happened. Simon and I were having another lunch meeting. We'd met a lot more times by now than I really needed to, if I was being honest. But the agreement was no longer the focus. It had evolved into something I looked forward to, and that, for the first time in a long time, made me feel good. I have a distinct memory of that day, because I had attempted to speak with Thomas the previous evening. I was particularly depressed. You know, he was completely engrossed in his thoughts about us. I even inquired as to whether he still thought I was beautiful. He murmured something about being weary and gave me the look as if I had just asked him what 2 + 2 was. It broke my heart. Like, how can you describe that emptiness, that type of feeling? In any case, when I went to meet Simon, I had that with me. I suppose I was seeking some kind of approval because I was frustrated. And so I was sitting across from him, letting my frustrations out. Close enough, but not specifically about Thomas. He's just listening too. He wasn't glancing at his phone, zoning out, or saying anything. It was fantastic to have him there, completely involved, laughing at my small jokes, nodding when I became frustrated about work-related issues, and simply being there. I once tipped over a glass of water that was on the table. "It must have been one of those days," Simon said with a giggle, and came to assist me with the napkins. I froze when his fingers touched mine. It didn't matter. I couldn't help but notice, although it was probably innocent. My cheeks started to get hot, and I believe he noticed too because his smile dimmed in a manner that seemed almost intentional. "It's nice to talk to someone who actually listens," he continued. I simply nodded while experiencing this strange gut flip without saying anything. In that instant, the entire environment surrounding us altered. It was as though the background noise had stopped and I was only conscious of him, his gaze on me, and the silence that existed between us. It was far too powerful for a public setting. I should have gone at that moment, or at least changed the topic to something purely business-related. But I chose not to. Instead, we continued our conversation, and each time he chuckled at anything I said, it seemed as though the distinction between business and other things was becoming increasingly hazy. He seemed to be providing me with the precise excitement I had been lacking at home, and I didn't want it to end. We went out together after lunch, but there was this awkward moment when we were both kind of hanging about in the parking lot. Usually we simply say "see you later" and part ways, but this time, I'm not sure. Neither of us made a move. We did nothing except stand. There's this strange tension between us. At last, Simon turned to face me and asked if I would like to join him for coffee. As simple as that. I paused, considering all the reasons I might refuse. I understood what that meant after all. Coffee was just an excuse. But rather than all the excuses for refusing, my only thought was that I didn't want to return home to the same stillness that had been bothering me for months. An empty house. I said yes. I could hardly recall the journey to his house. I kept telling myself that I was only going over for a cup of coffee and that I could leave whenever I wanted, even though my hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I believe I understood precisely what I was doing, though, deep down. As we arrived at his home, everything seemed so unreal, as if I were observing all of this from outside. He made me a cup of coffee. We conversed while seated on the couch, but it was no longer informal. Every syllable had weight, as if we were both uttering unintentional things. As if we were simply playing along until we stopped playing. He came a little bit closer at one point, but it was close enough for me to feel his arm on mine. When I turned to look at him, he was kissing me. I didn't retreat. I didn't stop him. I simply allowed it to occur, because it seemed like every annoyance and sense of being unnoticed and invisible at that very time, it simply faded away. It wasn't this insane, crazy scenario from the movies or anything when we ended up in his bedroom. It moved more slowly, as if we were both learning as we went. Even though I knew what I was doing was wrong, I recall feeling a mixture of thrill and humiliation, as if I didn't care enough to stop. I couldn't stop thinking about how alive I felt at that very moment, as if I had been seen for the first time in ages. Reality struck like a freight train once it was finished. I just laid there and looked up at the ceiling. My stomach is getting a terrible sinking sensation. What have I done? I kept asking myself. However, I also didn't want to return to that stillness, that empty house, or that ongoing sense of invisibility. I was aware that I had crossed a line that I couldn't get back, and I was already fearing the repercussions. But I also felt a sense of relief. I dressed and got up as quietly as could. I didn't want to disturb Simon because he was only half sleeping. All I wanted to do was go, get some fresh air, and figure out what in the world I was going to do next. I checked my phone as I slid out the door. Thomas missed 2 calls. My heart fell. I tried to think of a reason, and my mind flew into overdrive. Some justification for my failure to respond. It was a blur on the way home. I continued to practice my response in case Thomas inquired about my whereabouts. My hands on the driving wheel were trembling. When I arrived home, I thought I was stepping into a trap because I thought he would be waiting for me with questions. However, he wasn't. Like usual, he was asleep. not at all aware. I immediately proceeded to the restroom, shut the door, and gazed at my reflection. I had a new appearance, or perhaps I simply felt different. I tried to wash away the guilt that was already bothering me by splattering water over my face. Water, however, could not undo what I had done. There was no turning back after I had crossed that line. I kept telling myself that it was a one-time thing while I lay in bed that night. Just a careless, impetuous error. However, I felt deep down that I was deceiving myself. Simon would be back in a few days. I knew. The night with Simon after that was a haze. I attempted to refocus my attention on my career, my child, and being the wife I believed I had been the entire time. But I felt as though I was divided in two. I kept reliving that night in my mind, recreating every minute detail as if it were the greatest secret I had ever known, while another part of me wanted to forget it had ever occurred. I kept telling myself that it will only happen once, just this stupid, impetuous mistake. However, Simon kept coming to mind, half hoping he would text, half hoping he wouldn't. I would check my phone. Then one day around lunchtime, I received a message from him. Coffee once more? Only 2 words. With my heart pounding in a way that was quite absurd for a coffee invitation, I gazed at my phone. But there was excitement, as if I were 18 again. Sure, I said before I could argue myself out of it. I knew I wouldn't see anyone I recognized when we met up at a little location on the opposite side of town. He was sitting there grinning at me as soon as I went in. The guilt I had been struggling with ceased to exist. I suppose all I needed was to be appreciated. The part of me that was invisible at home seemed to have returned to life when I sat across from him. At first, we spoke about nothing but odd topics. How things were going at work, how he was handling his own customers. However, it was evident to me that we were both avoiding the subject of our past interactions. Despite the fact that we were not discussing it, there was a sense of tension in the air that seemed to be drawing us together. After a while, he turned to face me and asked, "Do you regret it that other night?" I stared down at my coffee, swirling it aimlessly since I had no idea how to respond. That I did regret it was something I wanted to communicate. But in actuality, I didn't, not totally. However, the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel important, made me feel horrible, of course. I was unable to express my wish that it had never occurred. I'm not sure. I partly expected him to just let it drop when I finally said it. But he didn't in the middle of a packed coffee shop. He leaned across the table and placed his hand on mine. I recall looking around in fear that someone would notice us, but nobody was watching. We appeared to be invisible. There were only 2 individuals who had been disregarded for so long that they didn't care who saw them anymore. For a minute, we just sat across the table holding hands and acting as though nothing was wrong. As if this brief period we were snatching was perfectly okay. "Let's go somewhere else," he muttered, leaning closer. I ought to have declined. I should have left at that moment, but I chose not to. We returned to his apartment after I followed him out of the cafe, as well as all that followed. It was a jumble of feelings. It was both exhilarating and horrifying. At that moment, I realized that I had allowed myself to slip into a pit. I was unable to climb out. Later that evening, when I arrived home, I felt as though I had a burden that I was unable to get rid of. I wished I could enter the home, see Thomas, and experience something. Warmth, some sort of connection. However, the home was simply silent as I entered. As I passed by, Thomas was seated on the couch, browsing through his phone without even glancing up. I made an effort to speak with him. I'll do everything to win his attention, to yank me away from whatever I had begun. I inquired about his work and the progress of his new project. Anything at all. He replied, yes, but his answers were brief and rambling, as if he was only beginning to notice my presence. Instead of sitting there chatting to me, I couldn't help but feel that he would prefer to be back at the office handling clients or organizing plans. I was suddenly struck with the sobering, icy knowledge that I was alone myself in my own home. It wasn't just that he was exhausted or preoccupied. We had ceased to be a team at some point. We'd split off into 2 individuals living together and leading separate lives, only following the procedures without even recognizing it. I was upset that he didn't seem to care, and I went to bed that night with a strange mixture of guilt and rage. I felt guilty because I was focusing on someone else, which was precisely what I detested about him. However, Simon's face continued appearing whenever I closed my eyes. I could hear him telling me that I was valuable. It was a lifeline of a sensation. I was unable to let go. After a few days, I made the decision to break up with Simon in order to prevent things from becoming more problematic. But before I knew it, I was back in his office reviewing documents and chatting as if nothing had occurred, as if we were only two coworkers going about our duties. Then, as we were finishing up, he gave me that same intense gaze, as if he could see through every wall. I would put up. "Will we act as though this is only a work-related matter?" His voice was low, almost demanding as he requested. I had nothing to say to him. Rather, this pull was more intense than previously. Before I knew it, we were encircling one another once more. My entire rational brain was yelling at me to stop, to disengage and leave. However, I was unable to. I allowed myself to be carried away by that emotion. Everything else faded into the background due to that excitement. We sat there in quiet after that. It's likely that both of us realized we had entered a region we were both unable to return. The stillness was finally broken by Simon, who mentioned that he knew this couldn't continue. He didn't want to quit, even though he knew it was an imminent danger. In actuality, I didn't leave his office that day either. I had an odd mix of exhilaration and fear. I felt as though I was in two different planets. I felt alive for the first time in years when I was with Simon, my family, and my husband and kid. I also had no idea how to make them work together. I tried to act normal at home and get over everything that night. I prepared dinner, completed all of the typical mom tasks, and assisted Ethan with his schoolwork. However, I couldn't stop thinking about Simon. I kept thinking about how I would experience that sensation again the next time I saw him, and I was more afraid of it than anything else. In actuality, I was in far deeper trouble than I cared to acknowledge. Even though I convinced myself that I could stop at any time, I knew that was untrue. Things just became disorganized in Simon's workplace following that day. I tried to hold things together at home while skulking around with Simon whenever I could, feeling like I was teetering on the edge of a knife. Every time I considered stopping it, I would feel that tug again, even though I knew it was wrong. I felt as though I was dependent on this secret. Being with someone who genuinely seemed to want me around was exhilarating. However, concealment was becoming more difficult. Thomas was first too preoccupied with his own affairs to pay any attention when I arrived home late or appeared somewhat preoccupied. However, he had been asking me little questions recently, like if I was indeed working late, or why I appeared so agitated. Little barbs that gave me the impression that he was picking up on things, nothing combative, as if he wanted to see whether I would confess anything. I made an effort to dismiss it. I suppose I wasn't as slick as I believed, but seemed casual. Because one Friday, when I returned home from a lengthy lunch with Simon, Thomas was already there. Instead of browsing through his phone as he typically did, he was simply relaxing on the couch, simply waiting for me while sitting there. His expression was difficult to decipher. It wasn't excellent, though. That much I knew. I was unsure of what was wrong, but I had a queasy feeling in my stomach. I attempted to dismiss it by saying, "Hey, you're home early," and then I proceeded to set my belongings down in the hopes that he would stop talking. However, he didn't. He said, "We need to talk," in a calm, quiet voice that strangely made things worse. Even though my heart was racing, I tried to keep my face neutral as I sat down on the couch. I was careful not to reveal anything. I didn't want to think he was aware. Perhaps he simply wanted to discuss the typical topics such as our son or stress at work. But I could tell by the look on his face that it wasn't. "Today, where were you?" With a glance that seemed to challenge me to tell a lie, he questioned. That's when I realized he was aware. Even though I was flushed, I attempted to speak steadily the entire time. "I hated how fake I sounded, but I was at work like usual," I said. His gaze remained fixed on mine. "Really? Since I stopped by your office around lunch, I assumed we might have a short snack, but they informed me you had already departed. Where were you then?" I lost my train of thought. That was unexpected. Thomas arriving to my workplace. That wasn't typical of him. It was the first time he had done it. Every reason I could think of was dissolving before I could even say it aloud, and I could feel the walls closing in. Despite my best efforts to remain composed, my voice sounded wobbly. I went to see a customer. It happened at the last minute. Not much. Thomas gave a nod as though he was thinking about it, but his expression remained unsoftened. Crossing his arms, he lay back on the couch and continued to observe me. I noticed you with him, which is funny. My heart stopped beating. He noticed us. I had no idea how much he had witnessed. I had no idea if he had been following us or had just happened to come upon us. It didn't matter though. I couldn't talk my way out of it since he knew. Unsure of what to say, I simply sat there. Every phrase that sprung to mind seemed to be exacerbating the situation in some way. With a long, trembling breath, Thomas shook his head. For what length of time? His question was hardly audible above a whisper. Although I wanted to lie and claim that it just happened once or twice and had no significance, I was unable to do so. I confessed, feeling the weight of those words descend on the room like a freshly detonated grenade. It had been a couple of months. He remained silent for a while. He simply sat there and stared at me as if he was looking for something in my face that would explain everything. His eyes were pained, and I could see it. He may have been angry with me, but this type of anguish was far worse, and looking at him became much more difficult as a result. At last he said something. Why? I had no idea how to respond to such a straightforward inquiry. How would you describe such a thing? Telling your husband that he made you feel invisible is a difficult task, that you would risk everything to feel seen because you were that thirsty for attention. I'm not sure. Knowing how pitiful that sounded, I stuttered. I suppose I felt isolated, as if you were no longer truly present, as if I were only another element of the pattern, an item to cross off the list. He chuckled bitterly. I work, therefore I'm to blame for this, because I made an effort to provide us with a life free from financial or stable concerns. As I shook my head, I could feel my shame mounting. No, it isn't. You're not to blame. I'm not sure. I know I made a mistake. He stood up from the couch and paced back and forth while placing his hands on his head as if he were attempting to keep himself together. I believed we were all right. Yes, we had problems, but I had faith that we would overcome them. I didn't think you would. As if he couldn't even speak, he stopped himself. The weight of everything, including all of my small decisions, was bearing down on me. I had finally paid the price for all the times I had disregarded the voice in my brain asking me to halt. He whispered softly, almost to himself, I trusted you. I believed that we were partners. I can't even begin to explain how devastated I was to hear him say that. I wanted to make contact and say something to put an end to it all. I knew it wouldn't matter, though. I had damaged something that words couldn't mend. Is it finished? He looked at me once again as he inquired, and this time I could sense the underlying fury. Indeed, even if I had previously been deluding myself, and part of me had held onto the notion of Simon as a means of escape, I knew it had to be, so I said it right away. I was aware that it was finished. It must have been. Without a word, Thomas nodded. I suppose it's just processing. There were a lot of things we both wanted to say, but neither of us knew where to begin, so the stillness between us seemed heavy. At last, he simply gazed at me, his face displaying a mixture of melancholy and another emotion that I couldn't quite identify. Are you even interested in fixing this? He inquired, and his voice had a tenderness that made me feel heartbroken again. Indeed. I could hardly get the word out, so I whispered, Yes, I do. I'd rather not lose you. But I could see by the expression on his face that it wasn't that easy. Perhaps it would never be. I had broken a bond between us, and I wasn't sure whether it could be repaired. There was nothing more from him. He only gave a nod, as if he had finished. Even though these were the last words he wanted to hear, it seemed like he had finally received the answers he needed. He left the room without saying anything more, leaving me to sit there by myself with the mess I had created. After our last conversation, I laid in bed that night and stared at the ceiling, wondering how I had allowed things to get this far and whether anything was still salvageable. The situation deteriorated. Thomas wanted more than time away. He desired for me to leave the residence. He said that he was sick of staring at me, that he had already begun the divorce procedure and that it was permanently finished. He wanted a divorce, but that wasn't the hardest part. It was the stipulation he established in return for silence. Thomas promised to fight for Ethan's complete custody. He gave me a stern look and threatened to inform Ethan about my affair if I didn't consent to ceding my rights. Ensure that our boy grew up understanding how I had deceived his father. More than anything, I was afraid when I heard him say that because I knew how serious he was. I couldn't take the chance. Knowing how badly I had messed up, I couldn't let Ethan grow up to despise me. I thus concurred. I gave Thomas complete custody of the house, my life, and everything else when I signed the paperwork. He even prevented me from giving Ethan a thorough explanation. He absorbed it all. He contacted my sister Olivia just when I thought things couldn't get much worse. I'm not sure if she volunteered or if he had planned this, but it was obvious she had sided with him the moment she arrived. Olivia didn't mince words. She treated me as if I were a complete stranger, as if she had never met me. She referred to me as self-centered, said that I didn't deserve to be in Ethan's life since I had destroyed my family and wounded everyone. She seemed to have prepared a whole speech, as if she had been waiting to vent to me. The problem was that I was unable to even contest it. With each syllable, I felt smaller and smaller as I just stood there and took it in. When she was done, she turned to Thomas and asked if she could be of any assistance. It dawned on me then. Olivia was not going anywhere. She wasn't only helping him. She intended to be involved in both his and Ethan's lives, perhaps even occupying the space I had previously occupied. I was unable to comprehend it. I had a family 1 minute, and then I was on the outside looking in. That evening I departed. Olivia remained. She took up Ethan's care, taking me up exactly where I left off. It was unreal, like if I were being removed from my own existence. I was without a sister, a spouse, and a son. Nothing at all. Following the divorce, everything quickly went apart. Perhaps Simon would be there for me, I thought. However, he disappeared as soon as he found out that I was no longer married. He didn't text me back. I began to suspect that he was seeing other people because he hardly ever answered my calls. At first, I didn't want to believe it, but I quickly learned the reality. He had spent the entire time with 2 other ladies. I was only a passing fancy, something to amuse him. I was now alone, divorced and discarded by the man I had put everything on the line for. I felt foolish, as if I had sacrificed my life for a non-existent object. It's amusing. Simon used to make me feel like I was noticed. That I couldn't obtain it at home, but he gave it to me. Ultimately, though, he had just taken advantage of me and thrown me away when I was no longer convenient. Then the work began. Ethan wasn't only brought inside by Thomas, he also targeted my career. He somehow informed my employer about the affair and my lack of professionalism with a customer. They did something nearly worse, yet they didn't fire me. They reduced my pay, removed my primary duties, and essentially forced me into this menial position. They said that I was damaging the company's name and that I was fortunate they didn't fire me completely. And so I was. No son, no husband, and no actual work. I was amazed at how quickly everything had collapsed. I promised myself that I would find a way to put things right, that I would somehow pick up the pieces. However, I was always knocked down by something else. Thomas consented to let me visit Ethan, but only in a coffee shop or a park outside the house. I tried to put up a cheerful front for Ethan whenever we got together, giving him the impression that nothing was wrong. However, I'd have to bid farewell after that. Observe him return to the life I once led. And it had struck me once again. I felt more like a guest than his mother in his life. I wasn't ready for the bomb that Ethan dropped one day. He casually informed me that he had witnessed Olivia leaving his dad's room late at night, as if it were commonplace. Uncertain of what to say, I froze. I didn't want to express how painful it was. I was crushed on the inside, but I didn't want to make Ethan feel strange. My own sister, who lived in the place I formerly called home, was having an affair with my ex-husband. Thomas sent me an email a few weeks later. Their engagement was being announced. He was getting married to my sister Olivia. I simply sat there looking at the computer, feeling as though everything I had been trying to grasp was slipping out of my grasp. I had lost my career, my sister, my son, and my spouse. The life I had created was completely gone, replaced by others who didn't mind going on without me. What's the worst? I was the only one at fault. I had created this disaster. I never imagined that the repercussions would catch up with me. Like a freight train, karma struck me. Furthermore, I couldn't act as though I didn't deserve it. For a fling, I had thrown away all that was important. For a self-centered, foolish error that was worthless in comparison to what I had lost. I quote, simply trying to live right now, attempting to salvage what little of my life remains. I keep telling myself that there must be a way to move on and put things right. To be honest, though, I'm not sure whether that's accurate. I'm not sure whether I'll ever get back the things I tossed away. All I know is that I must continue. One day at a time. Story 3. My ex-wife chose to leave me after having an affair last year. Strangely enough, I was relieved when it occurred. Our marriage may have appeared to be happy on the surface, but it was utterly hollow on the inside. Because of the financial and emotional toll she had on me, I felt devastated for years. She frequently took substantial amounts of money out of my account, making it difficult for me to pay our payments. Every time I questioned her about it, she flipped the blame on me, saying that I wasn't making enough money. She never thought my efforts were good enough. She appeared annoyed or upset by anything I did. I would make an effort to schedule family outings or dates for us in the goal of spending time together. However, she never showed any interest. She would become agitated or complain, wanting to just sleep in bed. I eventually stopped attempting to involve her in anything, which naturally caused her to whine more. Despite her lack of enthusiasm in participating in the first place, she accused me of keeping the kids away from her. She eventually started staying away from home at night. When I questioned her, she became annoyed and told me it was none of my concern where she was, even though at first she would claim she was sleeping at a friend's house, someone I hardly knew. I was feeling conflicted when my ex-wife said she wanted a divorce. I was rather concerned about how my life would turn out following the divorce on the one hand. However, I couldn't help but feel pleased that our terrible marriage was coming to an end. I took the time to thoroughly review every document that her attorney forwarded to me. As it turned out, her attorney was careless and made several errors in the documentation. Our divorce hearing was ultimately postponed by several months as a result of these mistakes. I would return the documents without signing them each time I saw an error. After then, they would need to be corrected and sent again by his office. However, they would frequently repeat their previous errors or create new ones. The documentation also had some really serious errors. My name was misspelled. Her name misrepresented our child's name and birthday, as well as both of our own. They misidentified our marriage date, named children who weren't ours, and even misidentified our home location. They featured businesses that weren't ours, dogs that weren't ours, and properties that weren't ours, even proposing a $500,000 payment for companies we didn't control. I thought it was hilarious that her lawyer's name was misspelled in one of the drafts. I was in the restroom and joked about it. Before they were able to correct the majority of these errors, it took around 7 revisions. However, there were still significant mistakes in the final document that was sent to the court. The sheer volume of errors and their simplicity made the entire procedure both stressful and somewhat humorous. Knowing that at least these misunderstandings were dragging things down and allowing me time to get ready for what was coming next helped to make a challenging situation a bit more tolerable. My ex-wife's attorney attempted to convince the judge throughout our divorce procedures that I should pay all court and legal costs, but I was able to refute this with a compelling argument. I made it clear that they, not me, were mostly to blame for the process's delays. The documentation they supplied me had so many mistakes that it took longer to correct everything. The judge did not order me to pay those costs as a result. My ex-wife moved in with the man she left me for after our divorce. As it happens, he has been abusive and is not a decent man at all. She abruptly stopped having access to my money after I changed all of my banking passwords. She was somewhat taken aback when she soon discovered how much she depended on my money to maintain her standard of living. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that she had been handling the payments for the house where we were staying, even though it officially belonged to her uncle because she was not paying. The bank nearly took the house away. Her uncle came to me in dire need of assistance. He informed me that I would have to make the back payments she had skipped, which came to almost $15,000 for 6 months of delinquent mortgage, if I wanted to remain in the house. I proposed purchasing the house from him since I didn't have that type of cash laying around. I was shocked when he said yes. The house that belonged to my ex-wife's grandma is now mine. The divorce has been finalized for a year. At work, I got promoted, and that came with a big pay raise. I'm still in the same house, and whenever I can afford it, I try to make changes. Although I haven't met a new partner, I've been having fun being single and meeting new people through online dating. In hindsight, it's almost comical that my ex-wife abandoned a secure relationship for someone who was very different from what she had anticipated, and that her actions almost cost her uncle his property. Although it didn't seem like it at the time, her choice to divorce me turned out to be a great benefit to me, in a manner. When she discovers that the grass isn't greener on the other side, she may attempt to return to you. But keep in mind that you should never accept her back, and don't allow her tears influence you. I'll give you the latest news now. It will be 1 year since my divorce was completed on November 3rd. Over the past year, I've made a lot of progress in bettering myself. I began going to a therapist who advised me to concentrate on my own development, and I have been doing just that. I lost more than 50 pounds after making dietary and activity changes. Since I've always loved soccer, I resumed playing on a regular basis and even began coaching my children's youth team. In addition, I rekindled my passion for reading and resolved to read a new book each week. At work too, my efforts have paid off. It has been considerably simpler for me to care for myself and my child since I got a significant rise and a promotion. Even with all of these improvements, my ex-wife feels the need to rejoin our life. The man she believed would save her from our awful marriage has become violent in her most recent connection. He has been violent, and she was hospitalized for one particularly bad episode. We had to call for an ambulance because our toddler was with her at the time. My ex-wife won't face charges or acknowledge what happened, even in light of the evidence. However, the tale is evident from the bruises. I was at a family gathering just last night. They asked me over, and I've always gotten along well with this side of the family. Although I was courteous to my ex-wife, I avoided talking to her and maintained a safe distance. Her family, however, seems to have persuaded her that we are still in love, which is completely untrue. I was not satisfied at all, even if my ex-wife could have been content with our marital status. In the latter 2 years of our relationship, I became so reclusive and inattentive that it seemed like I was only there to provide her with more money. In the last year of our marriage, she exploited me both financially and emotionally. She was having an affair with someone else. She would always deny everything and go to his apartment if I tried to discuss her affair with her. She accused me of not being supportive enough when I eventually caught her red-handed. In actuality, though, I was giving her every penny I made after covering our expenses. Due to financial constraints, I hadn't even purchased new shoes or clothes for myself in years. Then she unexpectedly showed up at one of the soccer matches. She asked me whether I was ready to move back in with her after the game. I questioned her why in the world I would do anything like that since I was so shocked. She began by telling me all about how we are still in love. We have a child together, and we believe that raising them jointly will benefit them more. I had to be honest with her. I no longer had any love or trust for her. She still owes me more than $1,100 for fixing her car, and I even informed her of that. What did she say? If we moved in together, she promised to reimburse me. I couldn't contain my laughter at that point and simply started laughing. I doubled over because it was so hard. She broke down when she saw me laughing, which, to be honest, made me laugh even more. Perhaps it wasn't the most kind response, but after all I've gone through and all the work I've done to better myself, returning to her, the exact person who hurt me so much, seemed like the worst course of action. I would never do anything to break the bond between my child and his mother, who still has a lot of affection for her. If she needs to turn away, I think she'll take care of it on her own by acting accordingly. I was surprised when she proposed that we move back in together. She didn't express regret or give an apology for what she had done in the past. Rather, she simply suggested that we move back in together, pretending that she is doing something worthwhile. Her way of thinking is really somewhat bizarre. Then there is our toddler, who had to endure the heartbreaking experience of witnessing his mother in danger. That has the potential to have a profound impact on him. In order to keep him out of such a dangerous situation, I believe it's critical to attempt to obtain full custody. Once more. Now for my most recent news. I've met a very remarkable person. I hope we can all find our own forms of happiness, even though I know it will take time for everyone to recover from all of these occurrences. For me, the past year has been a roller coaster regardless of the choices we make with our relationships. On November 3rd, I commemorated the first anniversary of my divorce. Since then, I've been dating and concentrating on improving myself via treatment. Admittedly, I've met some amazing ladies, but I've also met a couple who weren't a good fit for me. My ex-wife saw a Facebook post from my girlfriend just this Monday. Distribute. We had a great excursion together over the weekend, and Cher had shared some pictures. We had a great day taking lots of interesting pictures, indulging in delectable cuisine, and enjoying a few beverages. I genuinely enjoy sharing, but I'm not generally the kind to take photographs of my dates. I was so pleased to comply when she requested whether she may tag me in photos of our vacation. I was quite certain there would be some trouble if I shared those pictures. However, my ex-wife and her family's response to me was really strong. To complete the image, let me give you a little additional background. Before we formally dissolved our marriage, my ex-wife had been unfaithful for more than a year. She moved in with her lover while our divorce was still pending, and she was already dating someone else before we split up. We have now been separated for a year. My ex-wife abused me during our marriage by manipulating me emotionally and financially. She is still abusive, unfortunately, but she became much more hostile and disrespectful to me after I shared those pictures. She fabricated the tale on Monday to make it appear like I was the one who had cheated. She bemoaned how embarrassing it was for me to make fun of her by posting images of me with other women on social media. She called me a coward for keeping the fact that I'm seeing other people a secret, and accused me of being inconsiderate and selfish for not taking her feelings into account. She went so far as to imply that my actions had ruined any chance of us ever reconciling, claiming that my cheating ways destroyed whatever remaining love she may have had for me. She was yelling and scolding me on the phone during the entire time she was making these claims. In the meanwhile, I found her assertions' irony to be funny. Even though she was the one who cheated and was violent during our relationship, she spent a solid 30 minutes complaining that I had betrayed her and destroyed our relationship. I simply laughed. I told my ex-wife that I had been totally true and devoted until our relationship ended when she questioned me about my loyalty during our marriage. But she didn't stop there. She continued by asking me about my dating experiences following our split. That made me laugh even more. And because we are no longer together, I firmly informed her that she should not worry about my personal life. I told her she had no right to interfere in my affairs, just as I don't interfere in hers. In spite of my efforts to establish this boundary, she sent me a barrage of extremely nasty and abusive texts, criticizing both Cher, my current girlfriend, and me. She also threatened to send Cher direct messages spewing disparaging remarks about my marriage. If she felt it would make a difference, I told her she may try. Cher must be a horrible person for allegedly ending a nice marriage, according to my ex-wife, who then stated that she wanted to see Cher in person to see what type of lady she is. I had to really doubt her grasp of reality at that point. She had an affair, left me for someone else, and filed for divorce, and I told her straight out that our marriage had ended more than a year ago. My ex-wife started weeping through her tears at this moment. She said that she had been hoping that we might make amends in some way. "It's unjust," she protested. I had found someone else to spend time with and had moved on, urging me to concentrate on spending time with her and our child as though we were still a family. This entire exchange demonstrated my ex-wife's apparent inability to face the consequences of her own conduct, which ultimately led to the dissolution of our marriage, and how detached from reality she had become. Recently, my ex-wife told me that she is dissatisfied with her partner and that he doesn't treat her properly. To be honest, this discovery didn't surprise me because I had long suspected it. But I don't feel any better after learning about her issues. In actuality, I no longer feel anything for her, and I have no desire to reunite with her. If we didn't have to communicate at all, that would be better. On the plus side, though, I'm having a great time right now. Cher, my girlfriend, and I have found happiness together. She makes my life so much more joyful, and I constantly look forward to seeing her. She is the first person I contact when I get up, and the final person I speak to before turning in for the night. In the near future, we even have another vacation planned. I know my ex-wife could react negatively if I share pictures of our vacation, but I believe that having a happy life is worth any criticism. I can now see that my ex-wife has consistently attempted to paint me as the villain, which is a textbook example of narcissistic conduct toward others who are offering me advice. You're correct. I should refrain from being drawn into lengthy, meaningless discussions with her and limit our contact to our child. And while I'm ready for the chance that she would attempt to disseminate false information about me, my main goal is to move on in a constructive manner. Let us take a moment to contemplate. March 21st, 2022 was the day when everything changed for me 2 years ago. Not only did I find proof of one affair that late in 2021, but I also found evidence of maybe more. I tried to patch things up for a year after 23 years of marriage, 2 biological children, and a stepchild. However, it was hard to continue attempting to reconcile because of her persistent problems with mental health, PTSD, substance misuse, and secretive conduct, such as discovering a second phone she was using. She shot me in the side of the bed, which was the last straw in our marriage. I took the decision to put a stop to things permanently after that awful moment. In April, I filed for divorce, and by June, everything was done. I felt a great sense of relief. I felt as though I had been granted another opportunity at life. I hadn't realized how much anxiety and worry I had been dealing with until then. I can see all the blunders I made after learning of her treachery in retrospect. I responded incorrectly. I hurried into attempting to mend our relationship without addressing the underlying problems, rather than taking the time to think things out. By the time we started treatment, we had made the grave mistake of delaying seeking help. It was too late to change anything already. I felt a mixture of sadness, rage, shame, and heartbreak since our kids had already lost all regard for their mother. I felt like a zombie and was barely surviving each day. The amount of people who contacted out to give their support in April of last year was so overwhelming. Following the social media slander campaign my ex-wife started on me. She accused me of everything, including rape, assault, and stealing a substantial sum of money. Naturally, she neatly omitted what she had done. In response, I posted a brief PSA claiming that none of the charges were accurate in order to clear my name. I hoped that others would be open to giving me the opportunity to establish my innocence. But I also understood if some individuals felt the need to keep their distance from me. I concentrated on bettering myself in the interim. I lost weight, going from 250 to 185 pounds. I also took on a new position that came with the promotion, which was a big professional step. I intended to use phone applications for casual dating in order to experience a summer of vengeance. A former high school friend contacted me at this period. She was going through a similar split after learning of her partner's infidelity and lived far away. We began communicating on a regular basis, giving empathy and support, about 6 months after We ended up messaging one evening to catch up and share our experiences when I had to drive to Knoxville for work. As I spoke up how amazing the next 2 evenings would be, I had been looking forward to seeing some live music while I was there. However, my summer did not end up being as full with casual flings as I had jokingly envisioned, despite my original assumptions. Rather, a summer full of beach excursions, live music, and distillery tours took place. Because she really likes whiskey and just having a good time, which I hadn't done in years. As summer gave way to October, our bond became stronger. We were able to spend Christmas together, Thanksgiving with her family, meet one another's families, and even travel to Las Vegas for a long weekend of the Super Bowl. We became closer as a result of all these encounters. I am now very content as I celebrate my 52nd birthday. Since she's moving in with me, this birthday seems very special and wonderful, unlike the previous 2, which were really difficult. She is a nurse who found work in my city in the South rather fast. She has made the decision to maintain her home and allow her daughter to rent it out. What if a buddy were in my shoes? I could have warned them that it's too soon and too much. However, it seems like the appropriate thing to do for us. We're not in a rush to get married or do anything similar. We're just two individuals that are fed up with juggling our schedules and losing time with one another. To find out if our relationship is as solid as we think it is, we are moving in together. Many individuals discuss karma or exacting revenge on their ex-partners on this site. In my situation, my ex continues to text me when intoxicated and frequently expresses her desire for us to be together. They're apologizing and accusing me of being the reason behind our separation. She apologizes half the time, but she still believes that I am to blame for everything else. In actuality, though, I'm happy now that she's gone. In addition to meeting someone amazing, I'm less stressed. She is incredible, much more than I ever thought I'd be with. She's also quite interested in me, despite my occasional concerns that it could be too wonderful to be true. Therefore, I believe that simply by leading a good life, I have already received the best kind of retribution. I want to tell everyone that even if the things that occurred to you due of your relationship or marriage were terrible, you can still go on and find happiness. Sometimes people are unaware of their blessings until they are gone. However, you may discover that you're better off once you've crossed over. I told you my tale to encourage you to persevere through difficult times. A new beginning is always possible. Never forget to prioritize yourself and believe in your capacity to bounce back and prosper. It is possible for things to go better. I proved that it's feasible at any age by starting a new one at the age of 50. That concludes the status report for today. Remember to like and subscribe if you're following along so you don't miss any more stories. Till the next occasion. Farewell.